Imagine lying on a wooden table in ancient Rome. The air smells of vinegar, smoke, and iron. A physician stands over you, holding a bronze knife in one hand and a bowl of leeches in the other. There is no anesthesia, no antiseptic, only faith and pain. In the Roman world, healing was as brutal as the battles they fought. Doctors believed sickness came from bad blood, so they drained it. They cured headaches with electric fish, stitched wounds with linen and spider webs, and treated coughs with boiled mice. Yet somehow, against all odds, their strange, disturbing methods worked often enough to keep one of history's greatest empires alive. Tonight, we'll explore the forgotten, fascinating world of Romang. Medicine, where superstition met science, where the body was a battlefield, and where survival itself was an art. So close your eyes, and let's travel back 2,000 years, to a time when healing meant enduring, not escaping. The pain, bleeding, leeches and boiled mice, the curious world of Roman medicine. Chapter 1. When faith and medicine shared the same scalpel. If you close your eyes and imagine ancient Rome, you might picture marble columns, golden laurel wreaths, and armored soldiers marching down the Via Appia. But beneath that grandeur, behind the temples, bathhouses, and the Senate halls, was another Rome, one that smelled faintly of vinegar, olive oil, and blood. It was a world where medicine was equal parts ritual, guesswork, and superstition. In this quieter corner of history, far from the drama of emperors and wars, Roman doctors practiced what they truly believed was the art of healing. They stitched, sliced, burned, and balanced bodily fluids, all in pursuit of what they called salus, the Latin word for health. And for them, health wasn't merely the absence of pain. It was a delicate harmony of the body's inner forces: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When these humors were out of balance, the body rebelled and medicine stepped in. Often making matters worse, you might think of a Roman doctor as a learned man with scrolls and scalpels. But in truth, Roman medicine began not in the clinics of scholars, but in the kitchens and temples of the poor. A Roman matron treating her child's cough with honey and vinegar knew as much about medicine as some early physicians. Remedies came from nature and prayer, from what could be seen and what could only be hoped for. At the heart of this practice was the belief that illness came from the gods. Jupiter could strike a man ill, Apollo could send fever, and the household spirits, the Lares and Penates, could both protect or curse a home. To fall ill, therefore, was not simply a bodily failure but a spiritual misstep. The sick sought healing not from pills, but from offering small cakes of grain, cups of wine, or the sacrifice of a chicken. The priest and the physician were, for a time, one and the same. As Roman civilization expanded, it absorbed knowledge from Greece, Egypt, and the East. With this influx came men like Galen of Pergamon, whose writings would define Western medicine for over 1,000 years. Galen taught that every body was a universe in miniature. To heal it, one must restore its cosmic balance. His favorite method? Bloodletting. The process was as crude as it was popular. Doctors would use a small blade, called a lancet, or even sharpened reeds, to open a vein, often in the forearm or behind the ear. A basin was placed below to collect the dark stream that followed. The patient, pale and trembling, was told that their sickness was flowing out with the blood. Bloodletting was prescribed for almost everything: fever, headache, melancholy, indigestion, even heartbreak. And though many died from the procedure, those who lived were often convinced of its power. If they survived, the cure was credited. If they didn't, well, it meant the gods had refused to intervene. Roman soldiers were perhaps the most common patients. After a battle, doctors known as medici would move through the camps, treating wounds with honey and vinegar to prevent infection. They cauterized cuts with hot irons, stitched torn flesh with horsehair, and splinted broken bones using olive branches and linen. It was a brutal kind of mercy, often performed under torchlight, with only a swig of wine as anesthesia. And yet, even amid such crude methods, there was order. The Romans, ever practical, kept their tools organized in neat leather pouches, scalpels of bronze, tweezers for extracting arrows, and small hooks for holding open wounds. Some instruments have been found buried in Pompeii, preserved perfectly in ash each, one a silent witness to the agony and ingenuity of ancient healing. One particularly disturbing Roman cure involved the use of leeches. These small, slippery creatures were believed to rebalance the humors more gently than a knife. Patients would lie still while several leeches were placed along their skin. The sensation, they said, was strange but tolerable until the blood began to flow. When removed, the leeches left circular wounds that oozed for hours, which the Romans thought was a sign of continued healing. Another favored treatment was the application of boiled animal parts, especially mice. A mouse roasted and crushed into a paste could supposedly treat earaches or toothaches. Ground mouse bones mixed with honey were applied to abscesses. And for those bitten by dogs or snakes, the flesh of a roasted mouse was eaten whole. Whether this was symbolic, practical, or simply desperate, even historians hesitate to say. Roman women had their own medical rituals. To ease childbirth pain, they wore amulets made from coral and silver. Midwives, often former slaves or widows, used olive oil to massage swollen bellies and wrapped newborns in wool soaked with wine, believing it prevented infection. Fertility, miscarriage, and contraception were all part of their whispered wisdom, passed from mother to daughter, mostly beyond the reach of official medicine. Of all the strange cures, few were as unsettling as the use of human waste in Roman treatments. Physicians recorded remedies involving both urine and feces used externally and internally. Fresh urine, thought to be cleansing, was applied to wounds and teeth. Feces from doves, pigs, or even humans were mixed into poultices for skin infections. The rationale was simple. Waste carried the essence of the body and could somehow draw out disease. You can almost picture it. A Roman doctor, scroll in hand, instructing a household slave to collect pigeon droppings from the roof, or to bottle morning urine for a patient's next treatment. Such details, though unglamorous, remind us that Rome's pursuit of health was not unlike our own. It was a blend of science, superstition, and the simple will to survive. Not all Roman medicine was gruesome. Some techniques were surprisingly advanced. Surgeons performed cataract operations using fine needles, and dental implants made of ivory have been found in ancient graves. Doctors recommended fresh air, exercise, and moderate diet, principles still valued today. Baths were seen as both cleansing and curative, and the grand bathhouses of Rome became social centers of health. Inside, marble halls echoed with conversation as men soaked in warm pools, were scrubbed with pumice stones, and rubbed down with oils. Slaves scraped their skin with bronze tools called strigils, removing dirt and sweat. Then came a dip in the cold pool, the frigidarium, to seal the pores. This daily ritual wasn't just about hygiene. It was about control over the body, over nature, over decay itself. Still, one can't help but imagine the contradictions. Men debating philosophy while surrounded by steam and filth, their bodies steeped in the same water that cleaned hundreds before them. The Romans loved order, but their world was never entirely clean. As night fell over the city, apothecaries lit their lamps and opened their jars. Inside were powders of every kind, ground minerals, dried herbs, bits of coral and bone. Remedies were measured in handfuls and pinches, stirred with wine or vinegar, and sold with equal parts confidence and prayer. A man with chest pain might be given a mixture of poppy and myrrh. A woman with fever might be prescribed crushed pearls. And for the melancholy, a catch-all for sadness, fatigue, or madness. The treatment was music, poetry, or long walks by the Tiber. There was medicine for every ailment, but cures for few. The Roman Empire at its height stretched from Britain to Egypt. Along these borders, diseases traveled faster than armies, plagues, fevers, infections, borne by trade and conquest. Roman doctors fought a losing battle against invisible enemies, their tools dull, their theories flawed. But what they lacked in understanding, they made up for in determination. They cut, burned, and bled their patients because they truly believed it helped. It's easy now, from the comfort of modern medicine, to see them as misguided. Yet every surgeon, every physician, every herbalist who stood over a feverish patient, under the oil lamps of Rome, was doing what humans have always done, trying, in their limited way, to keep death at bay. And perhaps in that struggle, we see something of ourselves. Because for all the strangeness of Roman medicine, for all the leeches, boiled mice, and bleeding bowls, it wasn't cruelty that drove them. It was compassion, the desire to help, to heal, even when the tools were primitive and the outcome uncertain. But not every healer in Rome worked for virtue. Some worked for profit, and others for power. And as we move deeper into Roman medical history, one figure rises from the smoky depths of the bathhouses and backrooms, a man whose treatments were as theatrical as they were painful. His name was Archagathus, and in Rome, he became known by a title that no doctor should ever want. Chapter 2: The Butcher of Rome, Archagathus, and the Birth of Surgical Horror. When the Romans first welcomed Greek physicians into their city, they expected wisdom. They expected healing. What they got instead, at least in the beginning, was pain. The first recorded foreign doctor to set up a practice in Rome was a man named Archagathus of Sparta, who arrived around 219 BCE. The Senate, eager to modernize Roman healthcare, even granted him citizenship, a rare honor. They paid for his clinic, a taberna medica, near the Forum, where citizens could receive what was promised as scientific healing. At first, Rome celebrated him. The wealthy lined up to consult this strange foreigner with his neat beard, sharp tools, and shelves of herbal ointments. To the superstitious Roman public, he looked like a man who could truly bargain with death. But soon, rumors began to spread through the city. Archagathus, they whispered, was no healer. He was a butcher. The problem wasn't that he was incompetent, quite the opposite. Archagathus was a surgeon, and a bold one. He cut where others prayed. He operated where others hesitated. His methods were direct, even merciless. When a patient's wound turned black from infection, he would excise the flesh entirely. When ulcers festered, he would cauterize them with red-hot irons. He had learned his craft from Greek medicine, particularly from Hippocrates and Herophilus, whose dissections of human bodies had revolutionized understanding of anatomy. In Greece, surgery was seen as the highest, most courageous form of healing. In Rome, however, it was closer to sacrilege. The Romans prized endurance, stoicism, and public composure. Illness was a private shame, and surgery, a loud, bloody, and agonizing process, offended their sense of dignity. Yet Archagathus persisted. His treatments were excruciating, but sometimes they worked. He cleaned wounds with wine, stitched with linen thread, and used copper sulfate to stop bleeding. He amputated limbs when necessary, though anesthesia, of course, did not exist. Patients were held down by slaves, or by their own family as the knife went in. And all the while, Archagathus recorded his results, convinced he was pushing the boundaries of medicine. But the people of Rome didn't see it that way. Soon, the word spread. Archagathus' clinic was cursed. People entered and never came out again. The Romans began calling him Carnifex, the butcher. It was not an insult reserved for healers. It was the same word used for public executioners. To the Roman mind, surgery was not medicine. It was mutilation. The idea that one could be healed by pain seemed perverse. The priests of Aesculapius, the Roman god of healing, relied on dreams, herbs, and gentle rituals. The idea of using fire and knives, tools of the battlefield, was an affront to their tradition. And yet, Archagathus was only the beginning. The centuries that followed saw Roman medicine evolve into a strange and fascinating blend of faith and pragmatism. Wealthy households hired Greek physicians. Poor families relied on home remedies. The state built military hospitals valetudinaria for soldiers, and surgeons followed legions across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East by the time of Emperor Augustus. Medical schools had begun to appear, where apprentices learned anatomy using animals and, occasionally, the corpses of criminals. Medicine was becoming professional, but it was still deeply brutal. Roman surgical manuals, written by men like Celsus, described in chilling detail how to treat wounds, fractures, and tumors. The instructions were calm, almost clinical. When you cut into a living body, you must not hesitate. The hand must not tremble. The patient must be restrained by strong men. Blood will flow, but do not stop until you see the sound flesh. One can almost hear the sound, the scrape of metal, the restrained cry of the patient, the rhythmic command of the surgeon. These were not healing ceremonies, but controlled acts of violence in one particularly gruesome account. Celsus describes removing cataracts by inserting a fine needle through the eye and pushing the cloudy lens down into the base of the eye socket. There was no numbing, no sedation, only precision and pain. The Romans, in their way, accepted such suffering. Pain was proof of effort. To endure it was a kind of virtue. And in that endurance, there was faith not in the gods, but in the doctor. But not every healer was a surgeon. In the shadow of men like Archagathus, another kind of practitioner thrived, the charlatan. Roman streets were full of Medici Vagantes wandering doctors who sold miracle cures and elixirs. They wore colored robes, carried satchels of herbs, and boasted of divine visions. Some claimed they could banish disease with chants. Others peddled imported potions from Egypt or Persia, promising beauty, fertility, or immortality. The Roman satirist Juvenal once mocked such healers, saying that their hands did more killing than healing. And yet, people flocked to them. Even the educated class, suspicious as they were, could not resist the allure of something mysterious, something hopeful. One of the most popular treatments sold by these street doctors was gladiator blood. It was believed that the life force of a fighter, his courage, his virtues, remained in his blood even after death. After a violent spectacle in the Colosseum, spectators would rush to the arena floor to collect drops of still warm blood or scrape the sand beneath a fallen fighter. Mixed with wine, it was said to cure epilepsy. In other cases, the liver of a freshly killed gladiator was consumed raw by those seeking strength or virility. Pliny the Elder, Rome's great encyclopedist, wrote about such practices with disgust but also with fascination. He understood that beneath the superstition was a kind of logic, the idea that life, consumed, might restore life. This was the same reasoning that made Romans drink urine as a mouthwash or apply manure to wounds. It wasn't madness. It was pattern-seeking. They saw vitality in what the body produced, and they sought to recycle it, to reclaim it. Meanwhile, more respectable physicians like Galen tried to impose order on this chaos. Galen, born in Pergamon in modern-day Turkey, was one of the most influential men in Roman medicine. He served as physician to emperors, including Marcus Aurelius, and wrote hundreds of treatises on anatomy and disease. He dissected monkeys and pigs to study the organs, drawing connections between animals and humans. He believed that every symptom was a sign of imbalance, a clue that could be decoded through logic and experience. Yet even Galen's treatments could be cruel. He often prescribed purging, forcing patients to vomit or defecate violently to cleanse the system. He used enemas of wine or brine, and when that failed, he recommended bleeding again. In one account, he described draining nearly a liter of blood from a feverish patient. When the man collapsed, Galen proudly wrote that his color improved and that the gods had smiled on the treatment. It's strange to imagine such confidence, but that confidence was part of the medicine itself. Patients trusted because their doctors believed, and belief in Rome was half the cure. There were gentler healers too. In country villages, herbalists and midwives practiced quiet medicine. They brewed teas of chamomile and sage, wrapped wounds in moss or spiderwebs, and recited old prayers as they worked. They knew how to treat fevers with willow bark, which we now know contains salicylic acid, the basis of aspirin. They weren't doctors by title, but they were healers by trade. Some even worked with the priests of Asclepius. His temples, called Asclepia, were among the few places where the sick could rest in peace. Patients would sleep on stone benches, hoping for dreams in which the god appeared. In the morning, priests interpreted the visions and prescribed cures. Sometimes it was simple, walk in the sunlight, or drink from the sacred spring. Other times, the cure was stranger. There are records of patients being licked by sacred snakes in the temple, a ritual thought to bring divine healing. It's here we see a different side of Roman medicine, one not defined by blades or blood, but by faith and ritual. And perhaps for the sick and the frightened, that was the more comforting kind of care. Yet, even in the peaceful halls of Asclepius, the shadow of Archagathus lingered. His name had become a warning, his methods a cautionary tale. But his spirit, the spirit of intervention, of control, remained, for Rome was not a civilization that surrendered easily. To treat the body was to conquer it, to command it back into order, and as centuries passed, Roman medicine grew increasingly systematic. Hospitals for soldiers appeared across the empire, complete with records, inventories, and chains of command. They weren't places of comfort, they were machines for efficiency. Wounded men were categorized, treated, and either healed or dismissed. Those who could not return to duty were left behind. This military precision influenced all Roman healing. To cut, to clean. To balance, these became acts of discipline, not compassion. It's a paradox. In their effort to control the body, the Romans often forgot its humanity. By the end of the empire, the old gods of healing had faded. Christianity was spreading, and with it came new ideas about sickness and sin. Illness was now a test of faith, and pain was sometimes seen as a form of purification. The physician's role shifted again, from servant of the gods to instrument of divine will. Archagathus, the butcher of Rome, was long dead by then, but his shadow stretched far into the future. His mix of skill and ruthlessness defined Roman medicine at its core. Intelligent, disciplined, but merciless. He was the beginning of something humanity would never abandon. The belief that if we just cut deep enough, if we just try hard enough, we can force the body to obey, even now. In the sterile rooms of modern hospitals, echoes of Archagathus linger in every scalpel's glint and every surgeon's calm voice before the first incision. But what became of those Romans who couldn't afford doctors, temples, or prayers? Their medicine came not from scrolls or gods, but from the dirt itself. In the quiet corners of the empire, far from marble halls, they practiced healing that was simple, local, and sometimes wiser than the scholars. Chapter 3: The Kitchen Healers' Folk Remedies. Domestic doctors and the survival of the sick. Far from the marble baths and polished bronze instruments of the great Roman physicians, medicine in everyday life looked very different. It was not practiced in clinics or temples, but in kitchens, gardens, and dusty courtyards where the smells of vinegar, garlic, and damp herbs hung in the air. Here, medicine was not written in scrolls or inscribed on temple walls. It was passed down through conversation, from mothers to daughters, from old midwives to apprentices, from slaves to their masters. This was the medicine of survival, and it kept the vast majority of Rome's population alive long after the scholars and surgeons were gone. In an ordinary Roman household, the domina, the mistress of the home, was often the first doctor anyone consulted. She was the keeper of the armorium pigmentorum, the medicine chest, which held oils, ointments, herbs, and powders in small clay pots. Inside, there might be myrrh for wounds, honey to prevent infection, vinegar for cleaning sores, garum fermented fish sauce for stomach complaints, and ashes of goat dung, yes, dung, mixed with oil for burns. To the modern mind, this seems absurd. But to the Romans, each ingredient had logic. Honey was known to soothe and preserve. Vinegar was a cleanser. Even the dung, unpleasant as it sounds, produced heat when mixed with oil, perhaps helping to draw out infection. It was a world of experiments born of necessity. The Romans didn't understand germs, but they observed outcomes. If a cut healed faster when washed with wine, they used wine. If a bruise faded faster under cabbage leaves, then cabbage became medicine. It wasn't about faith. It was about results, however strange the methods might seem. And there were stranger ones still, the Pliny the Elder. In his monumental work Naturalis Historia, described hundreds of remedies that blended science, superstition, and pure imagination. His book was a kind of encyclopedia of everything: plants, minerals, animals, weather, and he believed that nature provided a cure for every ailment if only one knew where to look. Some of his recommendations were practical. Cabbage is good for the stomach and for hangovers. Garlic clears the lungs, others were less so. A mouse, boiled and eaten, cures bedwetting. The ashes of a dog's head, taken in wine, will relieve fever. A woman's milk, applied to the eyes, removes redness. It's easy to laugh at such recipes, but Pliny wasn't joking. He was documenting real folk practices, cures used in villages, workshops, and slave quarters. These were treatments that worked often enough, or seemed to, that they survived across generations. There was comfort in ritual. Even if the cure itself was uncertain, the poorer Romans, those who could not afford Greek physicians or temple healers, relied heavily on amulets and charms. The belief in natura, that every living thing had its own spirit and influence, guided their approach to medicine. A piece of coral might ward off toothache. A bronze figurine of Hercules might strengthen the body. A tiny pouch containing wolf teeth could be tied around a child's neck to protect against night terrors. Roman infants, in particular, were believed to be vulnerable to spirits and curses. Mothers often hung small phallic charms, called festina, over the cradles, not out of indecency, but out of the belief that the symbol of fertility could repel the evil eye. To modern viewers, this seems almost comic, but to them, it was as serious as any prescription. Medicine wasn't separate from the spiritual world. It was part of it. A fever wasn't just a symptom. It was an imbalance, sometimes a visitation, sometimes punishment. And so a Roman cure might involve both a poultice and a prayer, a salve and a sacrifice. The midwives or obstetrices held a unique and respected place in Roman medicine. Their work bridged the gap between science and superstition, between healing and ritual. A good midwife was both healer and counselor, trained not only to deliver children, but to manage the countless complications that could arise in childbirth. She carried a small toolkit, swaddling cloths, cutting blades, ointments, and herbs like pennyroyal and rue, used to speed labor or, in darker cases, to end unwanted pregnancies. Cyrannus of Ephesus, a Roman physician writing in the 2nd century CE, described in careful detail how a midwife should conduct herself. She must be of quiet disposition, not talkative, sober, and with hands soft yet strong. She must know anatomy, how to turn a child in the womb, how to sew, and how to comfort. He wrote of cesarean births, of postpartum fevers, of infant care, and even of breastfeeding techniques. It was, for its time, astonishingly humane. In this world, the midwife was the closest thing most Romans would ever have to a doctor. She worked by feel, by smell, by instinct, diagnosing illness through color, heat, and pulse. And though men like Galen or Celsus might have dismissed her knowledge as folk wisdom, it was her craft that brought life into the world every day. Meanwhile, in the Roman countryside, another kind of healer thrived, the herbalist or wise woman. These were figures of quiet authority, half feared, half revered. They gathered plants by moonlight, whispered prayers to local deities, and stored their remedies in clay jars and woven baskets. A rural herbalist's garden was a pharmacy in miniature. There grew willow bark for pain relief, poppy heads for sleep, sage for memory, mint for digestion, and mallow for soothing burns and ulcers. They also used worms, snails, and bees, grinding them into pastes believed to draw out poisons of the flesh. And when those failed, they turned to rituals, burning herbs in smoke, making knots and strings, tracing circles in dust. The line between medicine and magic blurred easily in Rome. In fact, it was often illegal to draw it, under the Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Benefices, a law against poisoning and witchcraft. Anyone caught using potions or charms to harm others could be executed. But because healing and cursing looked so similar, both involved herbs, incantations, and mixtures, many herbalists risked persecution just for practicing their craft. Still, they continued, quietly keeping their knowledge alive, even as official medicine moved toward temples and textbooks. As the centuries passed and the empire grew, Roman medicine reached an uneasy equilibrium between science and superstition. Soldiers were treated with surgical precision. Citizens were treated with herbs and faith. But medicine was also a mirror of the Roman soul. It reflected their values, discipline, endurance, and order. To heal was to control, to balance the humors, to force chaos back into structure. Yet for all their order, the Romans were terrified of death. They built elaborate tombs, carved their names into stone, and performed endless rituals to keep the dead at peace. When someone died, their eyes were closed immediately to prevent their spirit from escaping in panic. A coin was placed on their tongue for Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. The body was washed with warm water, anointed with oil, and laid out for mourning. And then the healers came again, not to save, but to protect. The living feared that the sickness that killed one might linger in the home. So they fumigated the air with sulfur, burned laurel leaves, and washed floors with vinegar and ashes. Sometimes, a physician would sprinkle salt and wine at the doorway to cleanse the breath of the dead. Even in death, the Romans treated the body as something that could still be managed, balanced, purified. But for all their ritual, their scrubbing, their bleeding and burning, the great irony of Roman medicine is this: it often worked, not because of magic or divine favor, but because of careful observation. The same reason modern medicine works. They learned that cleanliness mattered, even if they didn't understand bacteria. They knew that diet shaped health, even if they couldn't explain nutrition. They used honey and vinegar to treat wounds, both of which have real antibacterial properties. They failed often, yes, but they learned, and in their learning, they built the foundation for centuries of medical practice that followed. By the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, medicine had become both more advanced and more confused. The libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon held scrolls filled with anatomical insight. Yet, across the countryside, people still boiled mice for coughs and wore amulets for protection. The empire had given the world baths, aqueducts, and roads, and it had given medicine both the scalpel and the superstition. What survived in the centuries that followed was not Archigatha's knife or Galen's theory of humors, but the small, practical wisdom of ordinary Romans, the knowledge that healing is not only about science, but about comfort, care, and the courage to try. A mother mixing honey into a child's medicine, a midwife whispering reassurance in the dark, a soldier tightening a bandage with shaking hands. These more than the temples or theories were what truly kept Rome alive today. If you visit the ruins of Pompeii or Ostia, you can still see the marks of their medicine, the bronze instruments buried under ash, the jars of dried herbs, the painted frescoes of Aesculapius and Hygeia, the gods of healing and health. They remind us that the Romans were not so different from us, afraid of pain, desperate for relief, and endlessly inventive in their pursuit of life. And in that sense, their strange remedies, the boiled mice, the leeches, the vinegar washes, were not barbaric. They were human because when you strip away the centuries, medicine, at its heart, is always the same story. A frightened body, a hopeful hand, and the long patient wait for healing. And so the tale of Roman medicine ends not with the brilliance of a scholar or the triumph of science, but with something quieter, a cup of herbal tea brewed in a clay pot, a whispered prayer to a household god, and the soft comfort of belief that somehow the body will mend in that quiet faith. Romans left us something enduring, the idea that care, in any form, is its own kind of cure, and that was the strange world of ancient Roman medicine, a world where pain was part of the cure, and belief was often stronger than science. If you made it this far, thank you for spending your quiet time here with me. I hope this little journey through history helped you drift a bit closer to sleep, or at least to calm, if you enjoy these quiet stories about the forgotten corners of our past. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep, and maybe even share it with someone who enjoys learning while resting. Until next time, sleep well, dream of calmer times, and remember, history was never meant to keep you awake.